In a galaxy filled with towering space marines and gigantic war machines, the Mastodons stand amongst the most powerful of the Imperium's weapons. This titanic vehicle is more of a mobile fortress than a traditional armoured fighting vehicle, with the ability to bludgeon its way through almost any defensible line. With them being at the forefront of any battle, they're bound to pick up a bit of wear and tear as they roll into battle, and that's exactly what we'll be adding to these massively tiny vehicles. That's right, I'm weathering 2 Legion Imperialis Mastodons today to show you how to add the smallest weathering details around. With the extra small brushes out and some teeny tiny sponges at the ready, let's get weathering these tiny smaller than life tanks. On screen now is the list of all the paints we'll be using today to dirty up these big but small Mastodons, along with the additional tools we've used today to help along the way. As weathering is one of the later stages of painting, I've base coated, shaded, and even added transfers at the stage for the 2 Mastodons. One is painted for the Imperial Fist Legion, and the other for the Death Guard to show you how to weather these mighty war machines. First up, the Imperial Fist Mastodon. For this one, I plan to show you how to apply the super fine chipping across the hull. But before we start painting, let's do some practice. I find using a piece of card or a spare test miniature to practice making these fine lines can be incredibly helpful when learning this skill, before committing it to your miniatures. Better still is this technique can be applied to any miniature, regardless of its size. After loading your brush with paint, make sure to remove any excess by twisting the brush on a palette, until you are satisfied with the amount left on the bristles. This will let you control how much paint is on the brush, as we don't need much at all, and doing this helps pull the paint towards the tip of the brush for easier application. With the brush ready, I'll now start to do some practice lines and dots to test how much pressure is needed to achieve what we need. The more pressure that is applied, the more paint is released. Whereas for the finer lines and dots, you'll find you'll barely need to touch the model to get this super fine line. So with all that practice in, let's start work on this Mastodon. I'm using Dawn Yellow as a highlight colour here, painting this along all the edges, and as I do, I'll also add a few small lines coming off these here and there to simulate small chips and scratches along the hull. With these lines, I'll also damp the brush lightly over the edges to leave a rougher finish. For how many chips to add? That's totally up to you. It all comes down to how damaged you like the miniature to look. First stage completed, and this Mastodon is already taking shape. Now let's add some extra depth with our next paint. I'm going to add a darker line over the previous line work using Wildwood for some larger chips across the hull. I'm being extra light with the pressure applied to the brush at this stage, as this line wants to run in between the highlights across the Mastodon using just the tip of the brush for maximum control. What I also like to do is to dab the paint lightly over the edges for some slight irregularities, making the overall effect appear more natural and random. Importantly, this step doesn't cover everything. Just a few dabs of paint would be enough here to create the effect we're looking for. There's no specific reason why I've chosen this paint. Any dark brown or black will work here. I simply like how rich the brown shade is and how it can be used straight from the pot. Just remember to remove any excess paint on the palette, as we did in the previous step, and keep your brush strokes as light as possible. Now that we've gone all the way around, you can see how these dark chipping lines have significantly enhanced the appearance of the damage. Dirt time next, and for this I'm going to mix 1 part Rhinox hide with 2 parts Lamium medium, which creates a paint mix that flows nicely, leaving a lovely dirt buildup around the bottom of the Mini. This is a great way to add interest to darker tones and metals, like the black panels and the tank tracks. While I'm adding this to the tracks, I'll also flick the brush around the bottom of the hull and let the paint build up a little around here too, as mud loves to get everywhere. The more random, the better. We can go one step further by adding a lighter tone, like Mournfang Brown, for some added tone to the mud effect, applying a second coat to leave more of the pigment if needed. As you can see, I've applied this just along the bottom to allow the Rhinox hide to be on show above. We've just gone through how to achieve a rather clean-cut way of adding weathering to your extra small minis with well-placed, neat line work. But that's not the only way to weather. If we're weathering, I might as well make things really dirty. And who else could take up the challenge but the Death Guard? To start things off, we'll create a small sponge tool by tearing off a piece of the sponge and inserting it into the paintbrush tube protector. Perfect! This tool will make the application of paint to the model much more precise. Next, I'll dip the sponge into the pot of Wildwood and remove any of the excess by pressing it onto a paper towel. This way, I'll have just enough paint on the sponge to transfer when pressed, without making a large messy splodge. With the tool prepared, I'll gently dab the sponge over the Mastodon, allowing the paint to catch on the edges of each raised detail. This method is much faster for adding chips compared to using a brush, though it may be less precise in its application. Instead of dabbing, you can also lightly scratch the surface with the sponge, making quick rough-looking scratches on the hull. With the sponging complete, I'll use a brush to neaten up a few of the edges and strengthen the damaged look. Another fun way to use a sponge is to spread the paint over a surface to create textures and gritty variation to the colours. For this, I'll add a small amount of thin Doombull Brown to the hull, and then using a clean, damp sponge, gently dab away, spreading the paint out as much as I can from this starting location. This colour also has the added effect of looking like dried blood. Adding more shading is another great way to weather minis. So, to dirty this Mastodon down a little more before the next stages, I'm painting a heavy, all-over shade of Mortarium Grime for some added grime. You know, things aren't always bright in the grim, dark future after all. I'm also going to let this pool towards the base of the model for a darker, muddier tone, done with minimal effort. This paint has become one of my favourites to use. It's super transparent and shades things beautifully with its light colour. Next, I'm going to add some tiny streak marks along the sides using Mournfang Brown, where I've applied the wild wood. These streaks need to be very small, so to achieve this, I'll remove any excess paint from the brush and then press the bristles down on a palette until they fray just a little, leaving me with a brush that has multiple fine tips to use. With this frayed brush, I'll find a patch of wildwood as an anchor point and pull the paint downwards in one smooth motion, creating multiple thin lines in one go. Rivets are also great places for these streaks, especially on your larger models, which is where you'd usually find this type of weathering. You can repeat this across the entire hull as much as you like. I'm applying a fair few around, which gives the whole thing this really grungy finish to this well-used Mastodon, but you can add less or even more if you want to. Now that's all done, I'll roll the brush back into a point and it'll be good as new. Even at this micro level, a few well-placed lines really dirties things up nicely. One technique I like to do with my tanks is to paint their tracks to match the army, regardless of the scale. Take this finished Space Marine unit that features a muddy base created with Stirland mud, which is what I'd like to replicate on this Mastodon. I'll take a small dry brush and lightly pick up some of the paint on the bristles. Then I'll start dabbing the brush around the tracks and up the sides. It's wise to use an older brush for this task, as the grit in the texture can damage nicer brushes. Something like an old dry brush is a very durable brush that will work perfectly for this. Like all weathering techniques, you can be as light or as heavy as you want with this step. I want a super muddy war zone to be fighting over, so more the merrier. And to add some extra texture, I'll use a small old brush, and using the paint on the tip will let me just add the thicker amounts in places, while avoiding getting any of this paint into the ferrule and avoid damaging the brush. With all that mud attached, this Mastodon now fits beautifully in with the Space Marines, in turn matching the wider army as a whole. Now that we have the textured bottom in place, you can leave things here. I'm going to add one more coat of paint to show off this newly added texture. I'll mix 1 part Deepkin Flesh with 4 parts water for a super transparent paint. Basically, water with a hint of colour. When ready, I'll apply this around the mud, letting it soak into the recesses and texture. As this paint is quite transparent, it'll dry pretty clear, leaving the paint residue to dry in the details, leaving a washed out, almost dusty effect to the weathering, which is exactly what I'm looking for. One perk when working at such a small scale is that we don't need to focus too much on proportionality. Adding just enough detail will convey the appearance of battle damage on the surface. The main takeaways is to take your time and keep the pressure light on the tools being used, and you'll have your extra small miniatures looking weathered from battle. For more painting videos, head over to our YouTube channel. Or if you need more hands-on help, you can always pop to one of our Warhammer stores where our friendly staff will be more than happy to help. But before we go, we had to get a proper size comparison in order. We have here Ed from Masterclass's Blood Angels Mastodon to show off just how adorably small these Legion Imperialis ones are. Which begs the question, how many Legions Imperialis Mastodons can fit inside a fully sized one? For now, thanks for watching, ciao for now, and I'll see you in the next one.